Game of Thrones Season 8 is over. You can stick a fork in it. Now that I've got some time left over, I'm going to do some more reading. I've been recently captivated by Pamor steel and the use of meteorite iron, which I found completely captivating. So today we're going to talk about a meteorite called the Woman. There's the Stone Age, then there was the Bronze Age, where humans smelted copper for thousands of years before they developed high enough temperature processes to produce iron reliably from ore. This discovery was widely practiced after people became familiar with it, and this was around 1200 BC. Basically, that's the end of the Bronze Age, a time heralded by the beginning of the new Iron Age, and more importantly, about halfway through the Iron Age, the regular production of steel. So if iron was not smelted until the end of the Bronze Age and beginning of the Iron Age around 1200 BC, how is it an ancient graveyard in Gerza, Egypt contains 9 iron beads dated to 3200 BC that were actually shaped and hammered? What about Tutankhamun's famous ceremonial iron dagger that was strapped to his thigh dated 1400 BC, hundreds of years before the Iron Age? How did Eskimos, who could not dig the frozen ground for ore and had no real forests north of the tree line for bloomeries, how did they develop and use iron tools? Well, the first option is actually probably just as interesting as meteorites. It's called terrestrial iron or native iron. This is iron in a directly usable form containing about 4%, 2 to 4% nickel. So still very high in nickel, not as high as meteorites, but it's very rare and usually associated with some volcanic basalt type activity, which I guess in some cases renders the iron difficult to use. But there are famous examples in Greenland, Germany, France, Northern Ireland, Arizona of deposits of this directly usable iron, like pick it up off the ground, you got iron. It's not always very pure, but it's still iron. Some have postulated that it was used by the Hittites, where modern-day Turkey is now. Historically, the Hittites sort of mastered the Iron Age and were certainly recognized to be masters of steel. And they think, some people theorize that they had some deposits of this terrestrial iron that sort of gave them a leg up in the industry, so to speak. I don't know if that's ever proven. I read that somewhere and I've only seen it once, but the only source of terrestrial iron demonstrably used by ancient peoples for tools is that of the Ofovak deposit in Disko Bay, Greenland, where the Eskimos used that. It's interesting to note that not only does terrestrial iron contain high amounts of nickel, but it also demonstrates the highly characteristic Woodmanstatten pattern found when you also etch meteorite iron. So that's that cross-hatch pattern. If you guys go look up meteorite iron, thousands of meteorites fall through our atmosphere every year, but only a few hundred impact the ground. Most of those are pretty tiny, thankfully. Large meteors do find their way to Earth. In 2013, there's the Chelyabinsk meteor that exploded as it fell to Earth over Russia, injuring 1,200 to 1,600 people in the blast by breaking glass windows and things like that. It was likely about 20 meters in diameter. It just got so hot and was falling so fast that it basically exploded in a shockwave. And in 1908, the super famous meteor exploded over Siberia, leveling about 770 square miles of forest. It was thought to be about 50 to 100 meters in diameter. Essentially, most meteorites fall over the ocean. They're small. We never know about them. They are essentially just space rock in most cases. Not very usable, not very interesting, but occasionally they are up to 90% iron. The second most common ingredient in the space iron is nickel. So sometimes we're up to 98% iron and nickel here. Some meteorite iron is forgeable. Much is not due to contaminants, but throughout ancient history, peoples have found and utilized meteorite iron to some degree. Was this significant in history in any way? Did it contribute to the Iron Age in any way? No. Terrestrial iron and meteorite iron are essentially just about completely unimportant in the grand scheme of human history, but still super interesting. Again, I think we can connect the dot to the use of the meteorite iron and the ceremonial Chris dagger in Pamor steel in Indonesia, and just that whole tradition. And it just sort of fascinates me. That's sort of what's grabbing me here. So there's some famous examples that H. Coghlan in his book Notes on Prehistoric and Early Iron in the Old World, which I'm just starting to read, sort of cites. He actually lists a lot of sort of famous meteors and where they are. And some of them are several pounds. Some of them are 30 to 40 tons or more. And some of them are malleable and some are not as malleable. Scientists have had a hard time sort of classifying ancient artifacts as meteoric iron for several reasons. Because the first is that until the past century or so, instrumentation for measuring the nickel content of metals has proven unreliable. So you'll read in a paper somewhere that they've re-examined this artifact and it was thought to have 2.5% nickel. It actually has 7% nickel when we examine it with today's techniques. It was meteor iron all along. In a lot of cases, the artifact itself is in very bad shape. It's been rusted and corroded. There's been some mineralization, and most techniques have previously relied on testing the metal. And if all you're doing is testing the surface corrosion, it can be very hard to demonstrate what was there. There's newer techniques with X-rays and particles and blah, blah, blah that are much more accurate nowadays. At any rate, again, for meteorite iron, we're looking for nickel content in the 4 to 10% range, usually at the upper end of that. So much, but not all of the alien iron is malleable enough to be cold forged into simple shapes or shaped with tools of the time. And it didn't really require hot forging per se, although the iron work hardened quickly such that intermittent annealing was likely used. And there's some researchers who sort of took on that. There's a guy named I.M. Allen who successfully demonstrate early in the 20th century the forging of a small knife out of meteor iron. And several other researchers and their assistants undertook similar demonstrations about that time, and it was very clear that meteorite iron could be successfully worked into multiple shapes. It's been found in tools in Namibia, in Indonesia, North America. North American Indians used it. Jewelry in ancient Egypt. Iron fragments from Mesopotamia's royal tombs of Ur dated 3800 BC. An iron pin and crescent dated to the early Bronze Age from Alakahuyuk, which is sort of an old Hittite settlement. A cube of iron in a grave at Knossos and Crete. And there's been some other fixtures from Egypt. There's an iron ring from Peloponnesus dated 1500 BC. Very interesting. There's a ceremonial axe, and there's pictures of it on the internet from Azrahaman, something like that. I didn't write it down because one source said it was meteoric iron, H. Coghlan, but there's some more recent writings that demonstrate the nickel content was clearly 2.5%, probably not meteoric iron. But the most interesting thing about this axe, which is dated 1500 to 1200 BC, is that it actually has an iron axe and the edge has a steel bit. Yeah, believe that. This is right before the actual beginning of the Iron Age. An iron axe with a steel bit in the center of the axe. Back to our Eskimos and a meteorite called the Woman. In 1818, the Eskimos told British explorer Captain John Ross of a huge iron rock they used to make their tools with, but they kept the location a secret. They refused to disclose it. If you fast forward 80 years later, an American explorer named Robert Peary convinced the Eskimos to show him the meteors because, basically they weren't as an important source of iron as they were 100 years ago. And so the Eskimos gave up the secret, and they just showed him these 3 meteors, and they were named. One was named the Tent, and it weighed 36.5 tons. The next was called the Dog, and it weighed about 1,000 pounds. And then there was a meteorite called the Woman, and it was 3 tons. And it was very clear from the surrounding objects that this meteorite used to be twice its size as when Robert Peary saw it. And there's a 20-foot pile of stones, a 20-foot high pile of stones in an area close by that represented hammer-type objects that the Eskimos had used to remove chips of the meteor over generations and generations and generations. And they would chip off about 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters at a time and lay those side by side in a groove made in a bone or piece of ivory, sort of like a serrated blade. And in some of these meteorites, they actually found copper tools, old copper tools wedged, where people had over, hundreds or thousands of years tried to break off larger chunks of the meteorite. Peary tried to move, I think, all of them. at least 2 of them. And he ultimately, he took some of them in pieces. He ultimately got the tent to a museum in the United States. I think he was paid about what would be $1 million today for that. He basically, and he raked the Eskimos over the coals. As soon as he landed, he charged 25 cents for people to come on board his ship and look at the artifacts and touch a real Eskimo and all kinds of stuff. I think by some way or another, he left the Eskimos with the museum, and the museum just sort of put them on pedestals naked and probed them and measured them and treated them like, Neanderthal frozen in ice specimens. And then locked them in the basement, in their cold, dingy basement for a year while they were exploring them scientifically. And 4 of them, I think most of them died of diseases. I think tuberculosis, and completely awful. And so whatever part Robert Perry played in that while he got rich, I think is sort of despicable. At any rate, the Eskimos, like I said, didn't smelt any metals. They scavenged meteorite iron and actually scavenged copper directly from the ground. And that's where they got a lot of their tools and weapons. There was some archaeological digs that sort of concluded that, maybe these guys, the Eskimos, didn't have all that many tools. And what's interestingly is that much later, teams went back with metal detectors and uncovered hordes of metal tools and things like that. So they very commonly pass these down generation to generation, and it's likely that there are some old trade routes in which they gathered some tools and stuff, but they scavenged most of their metal tools, which I think is also interesting. At any rate, that's a meteorite called the Woman. I think it's a fascinating story, and the fact that it's, again, reaches back from several hundred years ago, where meteorite iron is still used in the Kris in Indonesia, and just jumps way back in time, back into the Bronze Age, basically, 5,000 years. So fascinating to me. At any rate, guys, that's it. You guys have a good one.